And by boiling the body, it would kill the DNA and germs and be easier to get rid of, leaving little trace.
Hate you. You're gonna die. I don't want to do this.
Hey, today's a rough one, okay? Which is kind of concerning. A lot of you requested I go over the Hello Kitty case. This case shocked all of Hong Kong and the world, and they called it one of the worst and most horrible sides of humanity ever seen. So born in 1976 in Shenzhen.
Okay, it's about to get real gruesome up in here, guys. Make sure you don't turn away from this, because it's about to get real gruesome up in here.
In China, Fan Man-yi was a troubled child. It began with her living with her parents, who decided to abandon her as a child, leaving her to end up in an all-girls orphanage in Matawai. And in the time she was there, she would never be adopted. And with an age limit set on taking care of young girls, she was sent into the world alone at the age of 15.
So she's out in the world, all on her own, at the age of 15. How many of you can survive in this cold world at the age of 15?
As expected, it was an extremely hard life living out on the streets. She experienced the worst type of things, and eventually she would get herself into the wrong crowd and get addicted to drugs. And this habit would lead her to rely on them, as it happens with drugs.
So on top of her being out in this cold world by herself, she got addicted to drugs.
The only way to afford said drugs is with money. Therefore, she had to get a job, and that led her into falling into desperation, which led her into Lady of the Nighting, if you know what I mean. But anyway, and eventually at 21 years old, she was able to get a job at a brothel called Romance Villa in Shamshui Po, where she would be able to pay for her addiction.
So she had to get a job to pay for her addiction. She was addicted to drugs. Guys, from the start, out the gate, this young lady was having all kind of problems.
At the gate, I mean, she started off in a terrible situation, went through another terrible situation, which was being in an orphanage, and then was kicked out onto the street at 15 years old. And serial killers or regular killers or just people wanting to take advantage of women specifically often come from this lifestyle, and it's heartbreaking. But that is exactly what would happen to Fan Man-yi. But anyway, she would go.
It's very heartbreaking. This happens to a lot of people, but not to this extent. Guys, you got to hear this. This is amazing. This is amazing what happened to this young lady.
On to work at this brothel, and eventually she would cozy up to one of her clients, Ng Chi-yuan, and get married to said client in 1996. And this guy was a piece of shit, okay? He was not stable at all, and to boot, he was also a drug addict. And eventually she would give birth to a son 2 years into her relationship in November of 1998. And their relationship was not great, as you could probably guess. Both of them were addicted to drugs. They had quite a abusive relationship as well, with neighbors constantly reporting loud shouting and arguments. And the child, of course, of them doing drugs and yelling at each other would be crying and screaming, so the neighbors would constantly send noise complaints because of them.
So she married one of her customers from the brothel who was also addicted to drugs, and then they turned around and had a baby. So this is getting sadder and sadder.
Less than peaceful environment, as you could imagine. And realizing this was no place to raise her son and her habits were getting in the way of her child, she decided she wanted to turn her life around. So she quit drugs and Lady of the Nighting, two very dangerous things in her life that didn't benefit her son in any way, and decided to work at a different place. And she would eventually get a job as a hostess at a nightclub called Empress Karaoke Club. Love karaoke. And to ensure that her son was truly safe, she would leave her piece of shit, drug-addicted husband and fly solo to take care of her child. But although that she was living a much safer life now, she was not making as much money and was really struggling financially to...
So she was no longer working at the brothel. She was still married to the guy who's also addicted to drugs. And now she's working at this karaoke place, and she's really trying to take care of her son all by herself.
Help her baby and herself. And it wasn't until about a year later in 1997 that she became close with another one of her clients named Chan Man Lok, a 34-year-old man. And Chan was not the best person to be friends with if you were wanting to turn your life around. And Fan would begin to fall back into her old life and drug addiction. And after a while, Chan realized that they had a lot in common as well. Fan was a lady of the night and drug addict, and Chan just so happened to be a pimp and a drug dealer. So just basically. And eventually, after spending so much time with Chan, she would become very familiar with his crew as well. Particularly his two henchmen who were beneath him, named Leong Shing Cho, aged 26, and Leong Wei Lun, aged 21. And
so she keeps running into loser after loser after loser. She started off in this orphanage, and then she married this guy who turned out to be a drug addict. She was also a drug addict. She tried to clean her life up, went from working in a brothel to working in a karaoke place, and then she met some other people that weren't too nice to her. And you guys, don't turn away, guys. This is crazy.
Chan wasn't just any pimp, he was a straight up gangster, okay? Being a part of the Wo Shing Wo triad, a very long-standing gang in Hong Kong. But despite the frequent business, money was still tight, and Fan was hanging out with gangsters who were throwing money like no tomorrow. And she started to become really used to that, and she just wanted more and more money. But the next thing that she would do would change her life entirely, and it would change her life for the worst. So on one of their drug binges in 1999, Fan stole Chan's wallet with 4,000 Hong Kong dollars in it, which is about $500.
You do not mess with a pimp / drug dealer's money. Okay, so her life is about to take a real serious turn for the worse.
USD. And she would do this because she was struggling with money, and with these guys throwing money at her constantly, she was starting to get used to having a little bit more money, and she was so desperate to have more money that she thought that this was some sort of solution, but it just made things so much worse. And Chan, of course, would find out that he was $500 or 4,000 Hong Kong dollars short, obviously. And the only person who he could blame was the girl that he was drug binging with, and the only person that he was around when the money had disappeared. Pay the money back. Which, I mean, she did steal the money, and paying him back, I mean, that's fine, that's all civil, nothing necessarily wrong there. The only wrong thing is that she stole money, but it gets worse than that. Because
so she stole money from this guy, and he is upset. He's wanting his money back, understandably.
Since she went behind Chan's back and stole his money, he kind of wanted to make an example of her. So he said, you know what, you also need to pay a fee of 10,000 Hong Kong dollars, around 1,300 USD, which is more than double than what she stole. And this was considered interest for stealing his money, basically.
So she barely had any money, and now the money that she stole, he wants her to pay back double that dollar amount.
And the intention behind that, not only making an example of her, was that now he could force her to work under him to pay off this debt. And this amount of money to recuperate would take a very long time for Fan, especially if she was pooling it into her child and drug habits. So she would eventually pay that initial $500 or 4,000 Hong Kong dollars back to Chan, but the rest would take a long time, and Chan was getting impatient.
So she was able to pay some of the money back, but she was not able, or she was still working on trying to pay him the rest, because he wanted double his money back. He was upset with her. He wanted to make an example out of her.
Obviously, Chan wanted Fan to learn a lesson. The lesson being not to steal from someone who has been so gracious to you and who also had a reputation to uphold as well. Therefore, Chan would send his two henchmen, Leong Wei Lun and Leong Xing Cho, to her flat, which was located in Laiyu Estate on March 17th, 1999. However, it wasn't just the two goons that Chan would send to grab Fan, but also a 14-year-old girl named Ah Feng, who will be important later in the story. So they would take Fan from her apartment and take her to a different apartment on number 31 Granville Road, Shim Sal Sui. And this was a very large apartment complex with over 5 bedrooms. And it was rented by Chan, not owned. However, he had full access to it due to his rent. And the original idea was to teach Fawn a lesson, forcing her to work completely under Chan until he was satisfied.
Do not turn away from this, guys. This is crazy.
Pimping her out to any man who would have her. However, before she could get back to work, they would begin to torture her. And this is where all the trigger warnings apply, so just a heads up. Chan, like I said, had changed his mind in getting her to be a lady of the night for him, believing he should make an example of any of the girls who dare cross him. Therefore,
so he began torturing her, setting an example for anybody who might steal money from him like she did. And these 3 characters help with the torture.
or she would instead be tortured in this abandoned building. Muffling is absolutely brutal. Like, there is a special dark place in hell for the people that did this to her. And it ranged from physical to psychological abuse to eventual SA. So supposedly she was beaten with metal bars until her bones were all fractured. And she would—
This is horrible. This guy was not playing around. This is horrible, but guys, this is just the beginning. Don't turn away.
would also be tied up with metal wires that dug into her skin, and they would continually beat her all through the day and all through the night, just taking turns.
Horrible.
And the torture would just progressively get worse and worse. These people were incredibly sadistic and would just experiment essentially on her in different ways to torture her. She would be strangled with a metal wire until she couldn't breathe. They would whip her as well, and she would often dive in and out of consciousness throughout these ordeals, with the pain just being so severe. And to ensure the pain was even worse, these pieces of shit would put chili powder into her open wounds.
Guys, this is horrible. They have been torturing this girl because of the money and because they want to set an example. This is horrible.
Just to make it hurt more, just because they're spawns of Satan. They would use other torture methods as well, such as burning her with lighters, and even on one occasion, Chan forced Fan to eat his own feces.
Okay, guys, who thinks of this kind of disgusting stuff? This is disgusting.
Are you okay? I mean, nobody's
No,
okay.
I ain't okay.
None of this is okay. But like this poor girl. Like, so awful. But in short, all of the people that were involved with Chan would take part in this torture against Fang. And the young girl, the 14-year-old La Mingfeng, known as Ah Feng as a pseudonym, would also reportedly take part in the torture towards Fang. Now, just a little bit about Ah Feng. She was one of the girls that was currently being groomed by Chan. So, I mean, in this situation, I'm going to safely assume she didn't really have a choice.
So not only did she have 2 guys torturing her, she also had a young female that was torturing her as well.
She sees another woman that went against this person that she's with also. She doesn't want to be going through that, so she was, I'm going to safely assume, forced to go through this.
So the young girl who was helping with the torturing, everybody seems to think that she was afraid to go against what was going on for fear it might happen to her as well.
Awful. And on one occasion, she would recollect seeing Chan kick Fan in the head over 50 times. And Ah Feng then also kicked her in the head, like joining in, essentially. And during all of this, just all of this horrible pain and suffering, Fawn was forced to say she enjoyed it the whole time. And
This is pure torture. Pure mental and physical torture. But it's not over. It's not over. Don't go away.
would say that she had to say this in order for it to stop, but they would often just continue to do it and torture her. Fawn did succumb to her torture, surviving around a month of continuous torture on either April 14th or April 15th, 1999. That is the day that she died. And this would spark an argument.
She died from the torture that they inflicted on her. This is horrible.
Between them, believing that one of the torturers didn't watch over her hard enough and that she probably got access to methamphetamine to overdose on it, which again, we don't know for sure. Either way, they now had a corpse that they needed to get rid of, and they had a sinister idea of how to do that.
So either she died from the torture, or maybe she took the meth in order to ease her pain, because this was some serious torture that was going down.
More trigger warnings of getting rid of a body, just putting it out there. So they decided they needed to get rid of this body. So they would drag Fawn's body to an empty bathtub. They would then grab a hacksaw and begin to cut her up into small pieces, therefore making it easier not only to relocate, but also get rid of. However, you can't just throw a body in the trash. The smell will lead others to investigate and throw off their entire operation. So they decided to do something else. They would boil each body part two at a time in a big pot. And by boiling the body, it would kill the DNA and germs and be easier to get rid of, leaving little trace. And this pot and stove that they boiled Fawn's body on was the same place that they would cook food that they would eat as well, which is just sickening. But their sadistic thoughts...
Wait a minute. So they boiled her to get rid of the body, and then they used the same pot to eat out of that pot. Something ain't right. Something ain't right. I think the young girl was doing whatever they told her to do, out of fear that the same thing might happen to her. But why would the two guys do it? That's just nasty.
Somehow did not end there, because they had extra plans for her head specifically. So due to boiling body parts, most of the time everything would fall off the bone, leaving just the bone exposed essentially. So after the head was completely boiled, they would take the skull and do something completely unthinkable. Supposedly, the home was decorated with a decent amount of Hello Kitty memorabilia. So these insane f***s, instead of throwing out the head, would take the skull of Fawn and grab a Hello Kitty mermaid doll and remove the Hello Kitty mermaid doll's head, and then stuff Fawn's skull inside the doll and sew it back onto the Hello Kitty mermaid.
These people were sick. They got too much free time on their hand to be thinking about this kind of stuff. These people were sick.
Mermaid's body. So Fawn's skull was now inside the Hello Kitty mermaid doll. And they would just set it back on the shelf like nothing ever happened. And this is where the story of the name of this case comes from. So a few weeks would go by after this whole up event, and they seem to have gotten away with their crime. However, the child in our story, the 14-year-old child, Ah Fong, felt different from what she had experienced and felt urged to go to the police. Now, with the danger of Chan finding out anything, but it was because she experienced some paranormal activity. On May 24th, 1999, Ah Fong would go to the police and tell them that she had been haunted for days and nights.
So the young girl that helped with the torture decided to go to the police and tell the police what happened.
In her dreams, by a woman who was bound with electrical wire and who was tortured to death. sound familiar? And the police would just blow her off, thinking that she was just a teenager with a very descriptive imagination, and they wouldn't think anything of it. However, she would clarify that this ghostly presence she was feeling was due to her involvement in the murder of this exact woman that was currently haunting her.
So she felt something was haunting her because she participated in the torture.
Do it. And willing to show them everything that had happened, she would do so if, in exchange, she was granted protection. So again, that just kind of coincides with she was just afraid that entire time that she was living in under Chan, which is...
Exactly, she was afraid. She did not want to go against what was happening because she thought the same thing might happen to her.
Again, just so incredibly sad. And she would then begin to describe everything that happened, everything that we already spoke about. And completely shocked, the police would get up and immediately go run down to the flat, to which a Hello Kitty doll was sitting on the bed. And inside the Hello Kitty doll, the police would find a skull and a ton of rotting insects as well. And all that was left of Fan was a few teeth and a fridge with internal organs stuffed in it as well. And the she was left in were disgusting and absolutely mortifying. Trash was left all over the floor, and it was just a decrepit place. So the police would try to be swift with their arrests, knowing how serious this crime was and his connection to the triads. The arrest was an absolute must. And Chan was just living it up, absolutely clueless to the events that were about to transpire.
So the main guy, the main guy was clueless as to whether or not he was about to be arrested for what he did to this young lady.
Be at his home with his wife. A wife? What? Spending quality time with a newborn child. Just letting that sink in. And that is when a SWAT raid team would come in early morning on May 28th and rip his dumb fucking bitch ass out of there. And this arrest would be announced in the news and the paper, and Liang Weilun fled to mainland China before he could be arrested as well. However, he would be later caught by police on the 14th of February 2000, after irregularities in his passport were found. And he would then be sent back to Hong Kong for the 17th of February trial. And the Yongqing Cho was put on Interpol's most wanted list, so he was sent back to Hong Kong as well, to bring justice to Fan Man-yi, finally.
So finally, everybody involved in torturing this young girl is about to be brought to justice. The young lady who was involved in torturing the young girl, she actually came to the police. So they did not charge her with anything because she came forward with all the details concerning the torturing.
October 20th, 2000, the trial would finally begin. Ah Fong would testify in this trial in exchange for her immunity. And during this trial, Chan and his accomplices denied intending to kill Fan. Okay, stating that they were just meaning to rough her up. Tell you what, you come over to my place, I'll rough you up, all right? However, they...
Rough her up? They boiled her in water, decapitated her, tortured her for months on end. That's worse than roughing her up.
Did not deny the fact that they dismembered her body in such a sadistic way and also hid the remains. Make it make sense, you know? Chan would be the one to cut off Fan's head, they would later learn. And Ah Fong would admit more to help the case. She stated that after they found her deceased corpse, they would beat it before intending to dismember it. Why?
So they would still beat her corpse, even though she was already dead. That makes no sense.
For what? And the court was obviously fucking mortified, and the prosecutor describing it as one of the worst cases in Hong Kong's history. And the defendants' faces while the crimes were stated showed a complete lack of remorse, especially from Chan, who was just stone-faced the entire time, just punchable-faced the entire time. And apparently, during the trial, Liang Weilun's sister experienced a mental breakdown, and his brother would smash and break a court door when the guilty verdict was called. And unfortunately, they were only charged with manslaughter and unlawful imprisonment. Make it make sense. So they were charged with life imprisonment, somehow with the possibility of parole. And
Oh my God. How can you give people like this parole? All this torturing that they did. It's crazy.
then the men who were examined at Castle Peak Hospital and Sulem Hospital described the trio of men as remorseless, even though the court had not learned of a case as depraved, brutal, and vicious. And what's absolutely mind-boggling to me is that Liang-Shin Cho was actually let out early in 2011 despite being sentenced to life. And after his 18 years, he was completely freed. However, he was then charged again and put in jail in 2022 for indecently assaulting a 10-year-old girl for 12 months.
So he got a history of doing this kind of stuff, torturing young girls. Something is wrong with him. He's sick.
Don't let monsters out of jail.
Exactly.
Because monsters remain monsters. And the media was obviously shocked, to say the least, horrified that there were people so cruel in the world, let alone in their backyard. And they were glad that the vermin, at the time at least, were off the street and locked away from the public. And
Good.
TVB reporters themselves even felt sick, describing the trial as crazy and scary. And many articles have been written about this, but many have been lost in time. However, 2 movies would be made about the case. One called Human Pork Chop, which
Human pork chop. Where do these people get these titles from? Human pork chop. That's disgusting.
no words, basically. And another called There Is a Secret in My Soup.
They boiled her body, and they named the movie There's a Secret in My Soup. Disgusting.
Titles alone are tone deaf and terrible, but I mean, this is from a different time, from a completely different place where I'm from, so I don't have a lot to say about that. But if they're anything like what actually happened, I'm sure they're extremely horrifying and brutal. Even the movie art for the cover alone is pretty horrifying. But the aftermath of all of this finally let Fan have her rest. Thank God. And the rest of her corpse was burned and cremated on March 26, 2000. And the apartment building now linked with this horrifying murder was eventually demolished in September of 2012 and has since been rebuilt into a hotel named Soravit. I'm not.
They hate you. You're gonna die. I don't want to do this.